Okay, what I'm going to share with you, this is blinding. I can't see a soul. So what I wanted to do was, over the next few minutes, share with you not just my story, but the stories that I learned as I traveled and lived and worked in 6 different countries on 5 different continents. I've been fortunate enough to study in India as well as the US, but I've also lived and worked in the UK, in Africa, 2 countries in Africa, Nigeria and South Africa, in the United States when I worked with the Coca-Cola company, and I lived in Santiago in Chile, also working with Coke. But the story I want to share with you is not my story. The story I want to share with you are the stories that I picked up in this very rich and very fortunate journey that I have had so far. The first story I want to share with you is something that has impacted all of us just about a week ago. And that is the passing away of one of the legends or one of the icons of modern day, and that is Nelson Mandela. I was fortunate enough to meet with him in 1993. This was just before the elections in South Africa. I had moved to South Africa working for Cadbury's, and I was living in Johannesburg. And talking about breaking barriers, my first lesson in breaking barriers is that the biggest barrier that all of us need to break is the barrier in our own mind. And I learned this lesson in retrospect, because what I witnessed when I went to South Africa in 1993 was the peace and reconciliation dialogue between the National Party and the ANC. And it was a dialogue that included the whites, the blacks, people of Asian origin. It included people of religious backgrounds. It included the politicians. But most of all, the thing that stuck out for me in that peace and reconciliation dialogue was how hope and optimism and the dream of transforming South Africa and the dream of creating a South Africa where there would be equity, where people would not be prejudiced on the basis of their color, etc., that was going to be the unified dream of South Africa. And of course, the architects were not just Nelson Mandela, but a lot of people who worked with him very, very closely, including people in the National Party. So I was fortunate enough to meet with Nelson Mandela at the opening of the Indian consulate in Johannesburg. And I got about 5 or 6 minutes with him, which I was recounting with astounding clarity. I can remember the tree under which we were standing this evening. There were a few people around, and there was Nelson Mandela. And I don't know about any of you, but you know, when you actually see somebody like him in person, it takes a while to get your bearings right and to even get yourself to asking a question. So I remember one of the questions I asked him was, what was the most difficult part of spending 27 years by yourself? And his answer to me, which has stayed with me till today, was, it takes a long time. And you know, in his typical Mandela accent, he says, it takes a long time to confront your own reality. It is not the reality of South Africa that I needed to confront. I had to confront my own reality. Who I was, what did I want to do, what did I want to create for South Africa? And that, he says, is the biggest confrontation that he had with himself in those 27 years, where on the one hand, you know, there is an aspiration and there is a dream, but on the other hand, there are moments where you say, how is this all going to work? So my first lesson, as I heard somebody like Mandela, and what came across to me was that at the end of the day, any of us, whether we want to create a small transformation, a big transformation, or a gigantic transformation, the first thing that we need to do is to transform the way we think. The barrier that we most need to break is the barrier in our own mind. Which takes me to a second story. It's the story of a person that several of us may not even have heard of. So I talked to you about Mandela, which the entire world recognized. He was the greatest living icon that we just lost. My second story is no less significant or substantial, but it's a story of a woman who I actually got to know when I saw a dance performance. And this was a dance performance that had taken the story of this lady who actually lives in a village in Karnataka. Her name is Timaka. And this was being choreographed in a Bharatanatyam performance inspired by the story of Timaka. And the story of Timaka is that she was uneducated, born in a poor family in one of the villages in Karnataka, married off at a very young age to someone much older than herself, and realized that she couldn't bear any children. Now, you can imagine what that means in the early 40s and 50s in a small village in Karnataka. But undaunted by that, what Timaka and her husband did was they took saplings of banana trees that the government used to distribute, and they started planting these saplings in their village. And finally, when they ended, they actually had a road which had 600 of these trees that were planted on this beautiful road. The entire village rallied behind her. Somehow, the international media discovered what she had done. Now, Timaka was not an environmentalist. She had not gone to school to be taught about regenerating the soil. She just used her innate wisdom and the compulsion that what is it that she could do to make her village, her environment, better off than it was. And she said, now I have 600 children and these trees are my children. So what did I get out of the Timaka story? What I got out of the Timaka story is that here was someone who had no resources to speak of, yet she was resourceful. Here was someone who had not been educated in the conventional sense in which all of us understand education, and yet she was ahead of her times. She knew what needed to be done. She did not let resources or money or anything come in her way, and she created a movement in her village that everybody followed. So when we think about breaking barriers, there are lots of stories that all of us know, and I don't need to share them with you. We know about people who are blind and who scaled Mount Everest. We know of people like Messner who climbed Mount Everest without oxygen. You know, we see the Paralympic Games, and all those events are testimony to the fact that there are lots of people who overcome a physical disability to conquer their own limitations. But what those people also do is that the physical disability is only conquered by this mental will, by this, by this irrefutable energy and aspiration to do something which is extraordinary. The last point I want to make is to bring it down to all of us. This is not just being inspired by stories that have occurred somewhere. It is also about what each of us can do to break some of the barriers that we are confronting in our own lives. Barriers where we see people who are not as fortunate as us, where we see people who don't have the same opportunities as us, where we are living in a city where we tolerate garbage on the streets. And then we say, is it an individual responsibility? Is it a collective responsibility? Or do we wait for somebody else to do something? So the last story I want to share with you is something that we've actually been working on in Britannia. It just happened to be something that I came across. And it just happened to be something that actually fit in very well into our business model. And that is breaking a big barrier called access to fundamental food and nutrition for the people of India. And it's a sad story because right now in India, it's not as though we don't have enough food to feed our people. We have enough and more food. And yet we are talking about a country where 47% of children under the age of 5 are either severely malnourished or moderately malnourished. We also know that there are solutions to these problems. And we also know that solutions to these problems have to be found in a manner which is collaborative. This story begins when I actually joined Britannia, and I was walking around our factories, and I saw large cartons of biscuits which said WFP. And when I asked what these were meant for, I was told that these are calorie-dense and nutrition-dense biscuits that we make for the World Food Program. And this goes to the United Nations to be used in those countries that are suffering either from a natural calamity or a war or anything like that. And we thought to ourselves that here we are making fortified biscuits for the rest of the world and not doing anything like that in a country where almost half our children are malnourished. What was even more telling when we dug into the facts and the data was that 70% of school-going children in India are anemic. And those perhaps include children who come to this school as well. There was a very important finding that was published in 2008 in the British medical journal called The Lancet, which for the first time proved an irreversible link between nutrition in the first 1,000 days of your life, which is from conception to your second birthday, and your ability later on in life for cognitive development as well as physical development. World Bank estimated that India loses anywhere between 2 to 4% of its GDP on account of low productivity that is largely related to the poor nutritional status of people in our country. 1 out of every 3 children that is born in India is born underweight. And the problem is significant and very, very severe for little girls, adolescent girls, and therefore moms who actually give birth to both boys and girls. So the question we asked ourselves is, how do we become part of the solution? And how do we begin addressing this? We tried all those routes in terms of talking to the government, in terms of figuring out whether there could be anything that could be legislated, similar to the legislation that was done with iodized salt way back in the 70s. But for whatever reason, we did not succeed. The reason I'm telling you this story is I want to connect it back to breaking barriers. Sometimes you have to go around a barrier. Sometimes you have to go above a barrier. Sometimes, like water, you have to just cut through the barrier and say, what is it that we can create with or without the help of everybody who actually needs to come in to find an enduring and lasting solution to the problem. So we did 2 or 3 things. The first decision we took, and that was a decision we made, we simply decided that we would fortify with micronutrients the biscuits that we sell commercially. The result is that 50% of what Britannia sells by volume today is fortified with micronutrients. And just to give you a sense of what that is, we sell about 12 million packs of biscuits every day. The idea behind that thought really was that at least whatever we can reach commercially, we should be able to do so. And what was interesting when we were doing this was that we found that there were no standards for fortification that we had in India. So we simply went and followed the WHO standards, and we said, we'll deal with any questions if they come. Fortunately, no questions came because we are following the WHO standards. The second thing that we did, and which is very important, is we created a Britannia Nutrition Foundation, where we said we would create public-private partnerships to get fortified products to children in schools who are the most vulnerable. Now, the government of India runs a program called the Midday Meal Scheme, which feeds 120 million school children with a hot midday meal. When you look at that program, you realize that what the children are getting are carbs largely, which fill their stomachs, but not the micronutrients they need in their early stages of growth and development. So in a very small way, we have partnered with NGOs like the Nandi Foundation, like Akshay Patra and some other local NGOs, where we actually work with pediatricians and we determine what the nutritional status of these children is, and therefore what are the micronutrients that they need. And this was a very small beginning for us to address yet another barrier, which we have the solutions for in this country, but for a variety of reasons, we are not able to get the galvanized action that is required in terms of access to hygiene and sanitation, access to potable drinking water, access to food, access to primary health care, access to immunization, all of which impact the health and nutritional status of everybody, and especially children. So what we are doing through this program is reaching children through the midday meal, where the midday meal is supplemented with micronutrient fortified products. And the reason we do a biscuit is because that's what we know how to make best. It is a carrier of the micronutrients, but it is also a carrier that people accept. It is universally liked. It is hygienic. It doesn't have to be cooked in water whose quality is suspect. And the most encouraging part of this work is that we've not just done the activity, we've also gone back and measured the impact of this activity. And I'll close by sharing with you what we discovered. Typically, when we go into a school where we give these micronutrient fortified biscuits, the hemoglobin level, which measures the iron status of children, is anywhere between 8 to 8.5. Now, most of us adults would be in Manipal getting blood transfusion if our hemoglobin was 8. But that's the hemoglobin with which these kids come to school every day. After about 90 days of these fortified products, the fortification level of which is determined by a pediatrician, we've seen levels of hemoglobin go up to between 11 to 11.5. Anecdotal data and other specific data that we've got also seems to suggest that children miss school less often, they fall ill less often, they are far more energetic, all of which are the good effects of getting micronutrients in addition to macronutrients in your food. So all I want to do is to end up by saying that when we think about breaking barriers is about creating a transformation. Breaking barriers is about the application of mind in terms of making something better than how we found it. And breaking barriers is the responsibility of all of us as individuals, because all of us in our everyday life confront situations where we either can break a barrier for ourselves or help somebody else break a barrier. I'll end with two lovely lines that I love from the poem Invictus, which says, "I am the captain of my fate. I am the master of my soul." Thank you.